You are a good person. You know that about yourself. You would never deliberately hurt someone who didn't deserve it. You would stand up if something was wrong. You believe that. Almost everyone does. And almost everyone is wrong. In 1961, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram ran a series of experiments at Yale University that would quietly dismantle one of the most comforting stories human beings have ever told themselves. The results were so disturbing that some of Milgram's own colleagues refused to publish them, not because the data was messy, because it was clean, because it was exact, because it was repeatable. Here's what happened. You walk into a university research lab. A man in a white coat is waiting for you. He's calm, professional, authoritative in a quiet way that doesn't need to announce itself. He tells you that today you'll be participating in a study on memory and learning. There's another volunteer already in the room, an ordinary-looking middle-aged man. You both draw slips of paper to decide your roles. You get the role of teacher. He becomes the learner. The learner is walked into a separate room and strapped into a chair. The researcher explains that the straps are to prevent excessive movement. You watch this happen and say nothing. Then you're seated in front of a large gray machine, a shock generator. Across its face, 30 switches are arranged in a neat row. Each switch is labeled with a voltage. The first reads 15 volts. Each subsequent switch increases by 15. The final switch reads 450 volts. At the far right edge of the panel, past all the numbers, 3 words are printed in dark red. Danger, severe shock, XXX. The man in the white coat explains the procedure. You will read the learner a list of word pairs through an intercom. Then you will test him. If he gets an answer wrong, you will press a switch and deliver an electric shock. Every wrong answer, you move 1 level higher. Every mistake costs more. You ask if this is safe. The man in the white coat says it might be uncomfortable, but won't cause lasting damage. His tone doesn't waver. You accept this. Why wouldn't you? He's the expert. This is a university. You are here to help. So you begin. The learner gets answers wrong. You press the switch. Through the intercom, you hear a yelp. You feel uneasy, but you continue. The voltage climbs. The yelps become louder. At 150 volts, the learner demands to be let out. He says his heart is bothering him. You turn to the man in the white coat. He says, calmly, please continue. You continue. At 300 volts, the learner stops responding entirely. He's gone silent. You don't know if he's unconscious. You don't know if he's worse than that. You ask what you're supposed to do. The man in the white coat says, an absence of response should be treated as a wrong answer. Please continue. And here's the moment that changes everything you thought you knew about yourself. You continue. Not one person, not two. 65% of all participants in Milgram's study pressed that final switch, the one marked 450 volts, the one past the red letters that spelled danger. They pressed it because a calm man in a white coat told them to, in a room that looked like science, for a reason that sounded like progress. What Milgram uncovered was not cruelty. It was something that makes cruelty possible without requiring cruel people. He called it the agentic state, the psychological shift that occurs the moment you insert yourself into a legitimate hierarchy. When you enter an authoritative structure, something happens inside you without your permission. You stop experiencing yourself as the one making the decision. You become the instrument of someone else's will. Responsibility doesn't feel like it belongs to you anymore. It floats upward toward the person in charge. And that floating, that small, quiet abdication of personal agency, is precisely how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary harm. And here's what makes this so much harder to sit with. The participants weren't tricked into cruelty. They were given every opportunity to stop. They heard the screams. They knew, on some level, that something was wrong. But there was a man in the room with a clipboard and a calm voice who had implied, without ever quite saying it, that he had already handled the moral calculus, and they were simply there to follow protocol. That phrase, just doing my job, might be the most dangerous sentence in any language. Milgram heard it over and over from his participants as they pressed switch after switch. They weren't violent people. They didn't enjoy what was happening. Many of them were visibly distressed, sweating, trembling, asking to stop. But they kept going, because stopping would have meant taking back the responsibility they had already handed over. And that felt harder than continuing. Milgram's findings were not a one-time discovery. They were confirmed, then confirmed again, then confirmed across countries, France, Germany, Australia, Jordan, with consistent rates of obedience hovering between 60 and 85%, depending on conditions. You are not an outlier. The odds are not in your favor. But Milgram wasn't the only researcher to pull back this curtain. In 1971, a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo ran what would become one of the most infamous experiments in scientific history at Stanford University. He divided a group of volunteers into two groups at random. One group were guards. The other were prisoners. No training, no script. Just a basement converted into a mock prison, some uniforms, and the implicit social logic of power. Within 48 hours, the guards had begun psychologically abusing the prisoners. They invented demeaning rituals. They forced prisoners to sleep on concrete, to perform humiliating exercises, to refer to themselves only by number. They weren't following anyone's instructions. No man in a white coat was telling them to do this. They were simply inhabiting a role that came with authority, and the role was doing the rest. Zimbardo ended the experiment after 6 days. It was meant to run for 2 weeks. What he found was this: character is not armor. Put a psychologically normal person into a role that gives them unchecked power over others, and you will not need to tell them how to abuse it. They will discover that on their own. The role doesn't reveal who you really are. The role replaces who you are. Even before Milgram or Zimbardo, a psychologist named Solomon Asch had already found the quieter, slower version of the same truth. In 1951, he placed participants into a room with several other people, all of whom were secretly actors working with him. He showed them a simple card with 3 lines of obviously different lengths and a target line. He asked each person in the room to say which line matched the target. It was easy. The answer was visible, unambiguous. But the actors gave the wrong answer, confidently, one after another, out loud. 75% of the real participants gave the wrong answer at least once during the study, not because they couldn't see, because the social pressure to agree with the group overrode the signal coming from their own eyes. You will distrust your own perception before you will accept being the only person in the room who sees things differently. Milgram, Zimbardo, Asch. 3 experiments from 3 directions, all arriving at the same conclusion. You will hurt someone if an authority tells you to. Power will reshape your character without your awareness, and you will deny your own senses before you'll endure social rejection. This isn't a dark chapter from history. This is the architecture of the human mind under pressure, and the pressure is always on. Think about the last meeting you sat through without saying what you actually thought. Think about the policy you implemented that you privately disagreed with. Think about the group decision you went along with when you knew something was off. Think about every time you told yourself, "That's just how things work here," and chose not to look closer. That is the agentic state. You handed your agency to the structure. You told yourself the moral weight wasn't yours to carry, and the machine moved forward. This is what Milgram was really showing the world. Not that humans are monstrous, that humans are social, wired to defer, to fit in, to trust the hierarchy, to take the role assigned to them and perform it faithfully, even when the role asks things their conscience would never approve of in the abstract. The man in the white coat didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply stood in the room and said, "Every time you hesitated, in that even and professional voice, please continue." And most people did. You live inside this experiment every day. Every institution you belong to, every system you participate in, every authority you've absorbed so completely you no longer experience it as authority. These are all running the same test. They are all asking, quietly, the same question. And most of us, most of the time, keep pressing the switch. You are still a good person. That hasn't changed. But now the question is different. Being good is not a fact about your character. It is a choice you have to keep making in real time, even when the structure suggests you don't have to choose, even when the voice in the room is calm and reasonable, even when everyone else is continuing. Because the real experiment didn't end in 1961. It never ended. And right now, somewhere in your life, there is a man in a white coat. He's standing just off to the side. His clipboard looks official. His voice is perfectly reasonable. And you are a good person, which means this time, you already know what he's going to say.